Hello, everyone. This is Professor Jake Hamric, and this is the 2022 Constitution Day lecture. So, this lecture is going to cover the following major ideas. First, I'm going to explain a bit about the term midterm elections and what we actually mean by midterm elections. Then we're going to talk about historical patterns of midterm elections. And then we'll have a brief preview of the 2022 midterm elections. And then I'll give some concluding thoughts. Now, before we get into the content here specifically, I do want to note that these views are my own. So they're not of anyone, through the college, right? These are my own views. That I have gathered from being a scholar in history and political science. Okay, so explaining midterm elections, right? What exactly are midterm elections? And what they are federal congressional elections that occur 2 years after the previous U.S. presidential election and 2 years before the forthcoming presidential election. So we had a presidential election in 2020. We'll have another one in 2024, right? So the 2022 midterm elections, right, are elections in the midpoint, if you will, of a presidential term. And so the term, right, congressional, right, is just that. These are elections, right, to the United States Congress. And so the elections include, number one, all 435 voting members of the House of Representatives. And number two, one of the three classes of the 100 American senators. So what exactly are Senate classes? And I've put here on the slide, right, a component, a part of Article 1, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution, word for word. Okay, so it is worth reading. Immediately after they shall be assembled in consequence of the first election, they shall be divided as equally as may be into three classes. So they being the senators, the seats. The seats of the senators of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the second year, of the second class at the expiration of the fourth year, and of the third class at the expiration of the sixth year, so that 1/3 may be chosen every second year. All right, so this ensures that as much as possible, 1/3 of the senators are up for election every 2 years. Right, so senators, right, have 6-year terms. But rather than have them all be up for election once every 6 years, right, the same 6 years, the Constitution spells out, right, staggered terms. So at least some of our senators, right, are being held accountable to the people every 2 years. The only constraint on how senators can be classified, we know there are two per state, is that you can't have two senators from any one state being in the same class, right? So, for example, right, the senators of Michigan are in classes 1 and 2. And so this coming cycle, the 2022 midterm elections, it is actually class 3 that will be up for election. So, right, this was something the Founding Fathers chose intentionally, right, to have staggered terms, right? Now, for the House of Representatives, it's not, they don't have that problem, this issue, because, right, they are selected every 2 years. So every federal congressional election, right, the Congress people in the House are up for election, okay? All right. Historical patterns of midterm elections, where we can actually learn a fair amount from our past about what we can expect in any typical midterm election. And so the main item to note here is that the political party that controls the presidency nearly always loses seats in one or both chambers of Congress. So we'll look at a link here to demonstrate some data, right, about these historical patterns. Okay, so I'm going to pull up a website here. This is an article from Sabattle's Crystal Ball, a website I refer to more in a little later on. Okay, so let's see. So I can find what I'm looking for here. Let's see. So if you look at table 1 of this article, okay, it shows change in seats for the president's party in midterm elections from 1946 to 2018. And you'll see that in this table here, the top row are the number of elections that we've had. So midterm elections have been 19, right, between 1946 and 2018. So 19 midterm elections. And we see that of those 19 elections, the political party that controlled the presidency lost seats in the House 17 of those 19 elections, and 13 of the 19 Senate elections. There were a few times where the party was able to gain seats. And you see in the case of the Senate, there were 2 instances, 2 elections where there was no change in the Senate composition. And then you look down here a little further, you see, right, the largest loss, right, one example, an extreme case, right, 64 seats a party lost in a midterm election. And in the Senate case, right, a party lost 13 Senate seats. So, right, it's a fairly, right, substantial loss overall. You look at the averages here, right? An average midterm election is going to see the party with the presidency lose, right, roughly 27 seats in the House and 3.5 seats in the Senate. Now, again, there are some exceptions, as you see in the table here, and usually that has to do with the political climate, the political environment of that election cycle. For example, in the 2002 midterm elections, those were the first elections after 9/11. And so what might have been a better election for the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party did not control the presidency, the Republican Party did, right, didn't turn out that way. It actually worked out pretty well for the Republican Party. And the political climate surrounding 9/11, experts believe to have a big part to do with that. Okay, but in general, right, the rule here is, right, the party that is not controlling the presidency will have a pretty good showing, at least to some degree. So if we look at factors that contribute to these results, there are 2 main factors we note historically. The first factor are what I have in quotes here, independent voters. I have in quotes because there's a lot of dispute in scholarship about how many voters are actually independent, what we mean by independent, what voters may be moderate, what voters may lean towards the political left or the political right, or actually might be in the political center, or may actually be swing voters. But in general, what we have discovered is that independent voters, however you want to define them, right, they tend to gravitate in midterm elections towards the party that does not control the presidency. And for the most basic reason, as just a balance of power. But of course, there can also be other circumstances going on, right, that can encourage those individuals to vote for the party not controlling the presidency. But independent voters, right, are one major factor. The other major factor is voter enthusiasm. The historical record shows that the voting bases, the voting blocks of the two major political parties, all other things being equal, tend to be much more motivated to vote when their political party is not in power, right? So that would tend to bode well, right, in this current election cycle, 2022, right, for the Republican Party, right, because they don't control. Republicans control neither chamber of Congress nor the presidency. So voter enthusiasm tends to be higher amongst the demographics that support the party that is out of power. So these two factors, right, are broadly speaking the two that contribute to these results. Okay. So looking at the 2022 federal congressional elections. So we have here on our slide the House of Representatives and the Senate. So what I've done here is list my takeaways, my analyses of seats that I would consider safe for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And what you'll see is that it's a fair number of them. So 155 Democrat, 187 Republican. Now, usually in an election cycle, like a midterm, there may be one or two safe seats that we see a stunning upset. And for various reasons, usually local circumstances, there's maybe a really bad candidate for one of the parties and they underperform, then there's an upset. But rest assured that those numbers there, it's a fairly safe bet to assume that those numbers seats to be safe for that political party. What that means is there are roughly 93 out of the 435 seats that are competitive, meaning that they can be considered a toss-up, could go either way. They lean towards one political party, or they are likely to go for one political party. But even like likely seats are at least somewhat competitive, so they're included in the competitive category here. So by most polling, I take into sort of an aggregate of polling estimates and looking at each congressional seat in the House, and the safe bet would be to say that the Republican Party is favored. I'm not saying they're going to, but they're certainly favored to win somewhere between 225 and 240 seats in the House of Representatives. Even if they won the very lowest end of that number, 225, they would have the more than the 218 needed for the majority. So again, I'm not saying the Republican Party is going to win the midterm elections in the House, but certainly they go in as the favorite, if you will. And so if they won, say, a halfway amount of those seats, so let's say the Republican Party wins 233 seats, then that would be a gain of something like 16 or 17 seats from the last election cycle, which would actually be a little bit under average, right from the table we looked at earlier, that shows an average of 27 seats being gained by the party out of power. But nonetheless, it would be a pretty good gain for that political party. Now, for the Senate, right, we have, again, not all senators up for election. So, in fact, 2/3 of senators are not up for election this cycle. We have currently 36 seats held by Democrats and 29 held by Republicans that are not up for re-election. So we have this cycle in 2022, we have 34 Class 3 seats up and one special election, right, because of a vacancy. So 35 Senate races. Now, out of those 35 Senate races, I would label 9 of those as being safely Democratic and 16 safe Republican. Now, it may seem like a lot, right? 25 out of 35, I'm saying, are safe seats. And in terms of the Senate, I would actually be much more so than the House. I would be astounded if there were upsets in the Senate races that I refer to as safe. In the House, there's usually 1 or 2, but it comes out of nowhere. At least from the national perspective, we don't see it coming, even though locals could tell you they could see it coming. But in the Senate, we have it's fairly a little easier to evaluate these races because of the national attention they get and it being statewide races. So what I would say is, if you take those safe seats plus the seats that are not up for election, that gives both Democrats and Republicans, would put them at 45 seats in the Senate. That's 90 seats. And that leaves 10 races to watch. I mean, it's not that many, but this is where I think the Senate's going to be won this election cycle. So we have, I put the 10 Senate races in categories based upon where I would rank them. So I put Colorado, New Hampshire as leaning Democrat. So I would pick the Democratic candidate to win those races. But again, lean Democrat, it could certainly go the other way, and it'll likely be close. And then I put 3 states, Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio, as likely Republican. So these races may be close, but what I would say is that, especially in the case of Ohio and Florida, past polls in the past few election cycles have tended to underestimate the Republican candidate. And there are all sorts of theories about why the polls have been all over the place in certain parts of the country. In certain states, they've actually been pretty good. In certain states, not so good. And I would say, for whatever reason, the polls have underestimated the Republican candidates in Florida and Ohio. So I would put, even though the races may be close, I would put those 3 races at likely Republican. A closer race that leans Republican is the Senate race of Wisconsin. Okay? Again, it could go either way, but I would say lean Republican. So that would put the total. So if each party has 45 seats, and you add these seats that are lean or likely, then that would give 2 more seats to the Democrats and 4 more seats to the Republicans. So that would put Republicans at a 49 to 47 edge, with 4 states that I consider true toss-ups: Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, Pennsylvania. So currently the Democrats have the thinnest majority possible in the U.S. Senate. Both parties have 50 seats, but because the Democratic Party controls the presidency and the vice presidency, right, the vice president, in this case Kamala Harris, a Democrat, breaks the tie. So the Democratic Party, right, is the majority party in the Senate, even though both parties control 50 seats. What this means for the 2022 midterm elections is that the Democrats need to simply, if the goal is to hold on to the Senate majority, the Democrats need to win 50 seats. So that means winning 3 of the 4 toss-up seats: Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, Pennsylvania. Now, if you look at some of the polls that are out there, you'll see that Pennsylvania, some political experts have Pennsylvania as lean Democrat. And I understand that based on a lot of the polls, Pennsylvania is one of those states where the polls, they've not been terrible in terms of polling Republican candidates, but they've not been incredibly good either. So I'm hesitant to put Pennsylvania as lean Dem. if I had to pick a winner, I'd probably pick the Democratic candidate, but I think it's going to be really close. So these 4 states, right, will almost certainly determine Senate control. And, you know, if someone had to pin me down, what I would say is I would probably pick the Democrats to win Arizona and Pennsylvania and the Republicans to win Georgia and Nevada. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that could happen. So if it went that way and the Republicans won Georgia and Nevada, then that would give Republicans 51 seats, right? The minimum they need to take a Senate majority. So we'll see how that goes, but that is just sort of a handicap, if you will, sort of a preview of the House and Senate races. You see here helpful websites. So I referred to a specific article earlier in this presentation from Sabattle's Crystal Ball. And Sabattle's Crystal Ball is one of the websites I would recommend you look at for more information about political analysis. If you want to get into details of like every single seat in the Senate and the House, and look at, you know, where they're rated. 538 is pretty good, really good using data. I do say that the political analysis, I think, varies from being okay to really good, but the data 538 uses is really good. And then Real Clear Politics. Now, in terms of the articles in Real Clear Politics, the articles won't be helpful in the sense that they're extremely partisan both ways. So, but basically, Real Clear Politics presents articles from both sides. But the reason why this website is good is it does present an average of polling data in the midterm election races. So it gives you a pretty good account of what polling averages are. And that's probably the best use of Real Clear Politics that I would recommend. So keep in mind for all of these analyses, and you see that some would maybe differ from mine. I think Sabattle's Crystal Ball and 538 may lean a little more towards Democrat than I would personally. Again, I'm not saying that to be partisan in any way, just for my observations and for full disclosure. If someone pinned me down in 2020 and said who's going to win, right, each state in the Electoral College, right, I did pick 49 of the 50 states correctly. The only state I missed, I picked North Carolina for Joe Biden, and Donald Trump won North Carolina. So I do have some understanding what's going on. I'm not trying to be partisan here. It's just that sometimes these websites do lean a little bit in their analysis, a little bit Democrat. That's just for better and for worse. So take that for what you will. Also keep in mind, when you look on a website like Sabattle's Crystal Ball of 538, right, if a race says like lean Democrat or Democrats are favored, right, that means that those political experts are dealing in probability. They're not dealing in predictions per se, right? It's one thing to say that the Democrats are going to maintain majority of the Senate. That is different from saying that Democrats are favored to retain majority in the Senate. Okay. Now, you'll see in 538, if you look today, you see that Republicans are favored to win the House and Democrats are favored to retain the Senate. I would argue that Republicans should be favored to win the House, but that the Senate is a true toss-up. It is going to be really close. That doesn't mean that one party might not win 52, 53 seats, but there can be some really close races. Now, something I want to mention here that I think needs to be noted for a current analysis of this election cycle is the 2022 political environment. So on the one hand, if one looked at this election cycle, say 4 to 6 months ago, it was really going to look like a doomsday scenario for the Democratic Party, right? With inflation, gas prices, right? A lot of Americans, right, not happy with the current economy, right? Those are things that usually spell disaster for the party that controls the presidency in a midterm election. And so I still think that is going to be, right, the one of the most important issues, the economy, right? It's obviously an important issue. Now, what happened in June of 2022, right, is the landmark Supreme Court decision, Dobbs versus Jackson, right, regarding the constitutional right to an abortion. And so there's some evidence that the Dobbs decision, right, that essentially has returned the issue of abortion back to individual states, that this has galvanized the political left, right, the Democratic Party, and that will largely offset the otherwise really bad political environment for the Democratic Party. I think what I would argue is that I think the Dobbs decision will certainly lessen the impact of the economy. And we've seen some special elections since Dobbs, and for example, in House races where Democratic candidates are outperforming the partisan lean of a given state or a given congressional district. At the same time, right, I'm not entirely convinced that means that's going to be necessarily a game changer and save the Democratic Party. It will most likely help the Democratic Party from a doomsday scenario. That much I think we could say. So the other thing to note, and it's hard to quantify this, is especially in Senate races, is the role of individual candidates. And again, this is not meant as a partisan statement, but if you look back at these Senate races here, if the Republican Party had, by any objective measure, if they had better candidates in Pennsylvania and Georgia, those races would at the very least lean Republican. And I'd be comfortable saying here right now, the Republicans are going to take the Senate, no questions asked. But by all objective measures, right, some of the candidates, for whatever reason, right, there's no judgment here, but the candidates that emerged victorious in the Republican primary are not viewed as strong candidates. And so that is also part of the 2022 political environment. So that's something to keep in mind. So use these websites as you see fit, okay? And hopefully they'll help you become a bit more acclimated to the 2022 midterm elections. So some concluding thoughts. Three things I want to mention here. Number one, recasting midterm elections. What I mean by that is, and this is why I say this is a view of Professor Jake Hamric, not Mid-Michigan College. I'm personally not really satisfied with the term midterm elections for various reasons. For starters, coining a term midterm elections essentially, right, it puts at the front and center the presidency. Right? What are these elections? They're a midterm of a presidency. Right? And for me, these midterm elections, right, should be about much more than the presidency. They should be just about what they are, and that is federal congressional elections. Right? I don't think the founding fathers would have been thrilled to have, right, these elections be called midterm elections, considering that Article 1 of the Constitution, right, deals with Congress, not the presidency. And so, right, thinking of these elections as just midterm elections, I think does a disservice to how important these elections are. It's also can be a bit confusing because in presidential election years like 2020 and like we'll see in 2024, there are still congressional elections, right? The House of Representatives has elections every 2 years. And every 2 years, there's a certain class of senators that's up for election. So in 2024, right, Class 1, including one of the 2 Senate seats in Michigan, will be up for re-election, right? And so when I hear like midterm presidential elections, this dichotomy, right, it centralizes, right, the role of the presidency, which I think is bad in general, but also I think it confuses, it paints an incomplete picture of what actually is going on here. Okay. The other problematic nature of midterm elections using that term has to do with concluding thought number 2. And that is the fact that there are very important state and local elections, right? This November as well, right? So, for example, here in Michigan, right, there is a race for the governor, right? Race for we have members of the Michigan state legislature. There are ballot proposals, right, regarding issues like voting and abortion, right? So you have, right, some really important issues, right, at state and local levels that can sort of be minimized by the media when we just say midterm elections. So in many ways, one could argue, in fact, that state and local elections affect our daily lives as much, if not more, than federal elections. And so what I would do is just point you to this website here, michigan.gov, Secretary of State, right? And you can find information about the elections, okay, here going on in Michigan. And with that in mind, my third concluding thought is that one thing that we are trying to do here at Mid, I currently lead a team of what's known as Mid Votes. We are trying to encourage civic engagement, right? Basically, people being involved in the political process, and the starting point, not the end point, is is voting and being educated about voting. So I have a link here in the slide that refers to votereducationweek.org. So next week is officially National Voter Education Week. Mid will be promoting that through social media. There will be tables with volunteers, answering questions, providing information on the Harrison and Mount Pleasant campuses. And so hopefully this Constitution Day lecture will be part of Voter Education Week as well. And so we just want, to have the community members of our community, be aware of, the voting process and become engaged and hopefully, exercise their right to vote. And so I hope you consider doing so. So thank you very much. I hope this presentation has been helpful. Take care, everybody. Thank you.